Welcome to the first episode of Leadership with Leela Life. Uh, so thank you very much for joining me today. What we can do to start with is a quick introduction, yeah, and then we get into the conversation. So shall we start with you, John? Just what you do and where you come from and what your interest is.
Yeah, sure. I have worked in the financial sector here in New York for the past 20 years after having grown up in a rural part of the country. And that is working with companies, a range of sort of market leaders, but then also more disruptive fintechs.
Okay. All right. And what's your current role? And just to give us context of the leadership role that you.
Yeah, I currently work as an independent advisor, so I work with about 5 different companies. And so it's fast paced. You got to keep track of all different things. I've got 5, 6 different email addresses. So it's a lot to track.
And with senior executives in those companies, I assume, yeah.
Yeah, it's working with senior executives. And so my background is working with CFOs, CEOs, board members, things like that. So having responsibility for running programs and reporting directly to them.
Got it. Okay. Welcome.
Thank you.
James.
So I've actually just stepped away from a almost 25-year corporate career doing competitive strategy. Most of that was advisory work for CEOs and CFOs, funnily enough. So I've been a close advisor to, I think, 5 CEOs in my career, which is pretty cool. Now I'm doing executive coaching and independent advisory work. So I hate to be so consistent.
Welcome again.
Thank you.
James. Ellie.
Hi. I left the corporate world after 35 years as a chief people officer in the advertising, media, entertainment sector, and ended up going back to school. And I'm a holistic well-being coach and the global ambassador for Leela Life. And the blend of my experience between corporate HR in a high service space, supporting leaders, I've seen a lot of what works and what doesn't work from the leadership perspective. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. The intersection between leadership and wellness and well-being is so important. And as a holistic well-being coach, I'm working with a lot of private folks supporting the blend of exactly well-being and how to enhance their leadership. So.
Okay. Welcome. This is great. So what we'll do today is to spend a little bit of time talking about the challenges we face as leaders, challenges that leadership faces today generally, and then try and identify what are some of the bigger trends around challenges of leadership, right? Second is we will also spend some time talking about well-being, right? What does well-being mean for leaders today? Are they sort of able to manage that, get their well-being sorted or not? And what are the challenges, if any, right? And then we end up with sort of having a conversation around the Leela Life world, the world of Indic knowledge, and how is it that that knowledge can be brought to bear for leaders to sort of, solve some of these challenges and potentially find a path forward. Make sense?
Sounds good.
All right, let's start. Who wants to start? James, would you like to?
Oh, sure. Why not?
Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you for warning me before we came in, because I thought about this for a moment. I think for me, as a leader myself, the greatest journey was actually finding authenticity. So I sort of kind of stumbled into a business career. My undergraduate degree was in English, and my dad owned a business. I worked for him for a little while. Didn't love working in a family business, and then kind of started working in corporate business. But my first job was with a very conservative Midwestern U.S. company, and I didn't really know how to act corporate. That's not really my background. I never knew anyone who worked for a corporation. I'm a first-generation college graduate. So I spent a lot of time kind of trying on different personas, usually far more staid and conservative than my actual personality. And I don't think it was until like fairly late in my career where I started to realize like I can just be me. I'm quite introverted. And I think there was a lot of pressure when I first started working in leadership roles to be extroverted and be ebullient. And it came off as false, and as I kind of developed my own style and became comfortable with being introverted, and I'm fine having a conversation like this. I just don't like talking to a large room. And by the way, I can do it. I can just do it in the way that I do it. But I think that journey to figuring out like who I was going to be. And this is something that kind of is a thread that goes through my coaching practice, because it's one of the first things I ask a coaching client too, is like, well, who do you want to be? Don't try to be somebody else. Try to be a version of you that makes you happy.
Right. Yeah, indeed. No, that point about authenticity is so, I hear that a lot from people uh, after they cross a certain point. They start to sense that, that's actually a core thing. Yeah, so I think we should dwell into that a little bit more as we talk further. Authenticity. Great stuff. Eileen, what about you?
It's when I think back about over the course of my career, the people, the leaders that I've been exposed to, I learned so much of what not to be as much as to admire to be.
To be. Okay, gotcha.
And I was always very lucky. I always felt like I had a seat at the table, and I worked for very strong women, and I saw women very early in my career in a leadership position. And back, 30 plus years ago, that was not that it was unusual, but it was a different time for women leadership. And over the years, I've worked for some very difficult leaders. And I think that's what helped me find my way of really what I didn't like what I was experiencing. And so I didn't want anybody to ever experience that kind of interaction from a leader, because a person who's in a position of leadership, it's really about influence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very powerful position. And depending upon how you yield that, can be positive or not as positive. And I came up with this notion of, even though I might be the leader, I always said to myself in an inverse way, I work for you, meaning everybody that was reporting up, I sort of flipped the hierarchy, and that just positioned me in a way that made me want to come alongside the people that I was leading. And so I've always said, like, I work for you. You might report up in that hierarchical way, but I wanted to dismantle that hierarchical framework, because I think it just breeds not the best in terms of interpersonal relationships. And I've spent a lot of time focusing on, same like you, James, the authenticity of just, I am who I am. I'm going to lead my way. You're going to lead your way. And there's room for everybody to be. I do think there's some basic principles and core values that I would like to see more of out in the universe from a leadership perspective. And I'm looking forward to how Wellbeing and the Indic system can help bring people to that place.
Very good. Very interesting. So again, I think what I'm hearing is somewhere along the way, you kind of figured out that this is the core proposition in leadership that you're going to sort of address, and in being you as you being the leader, and which is really saying that I don't want to be the leader in that way. Mm-hmm. I want to be leader in this way, and this way, in your sense, was flipping the hierarchy narrative and saying that how do I serve people who, in a sense, otherwise would work for me. But you sort of
like I say, that old command and control kind of which I did not aspire to at all. I don't think it works, and I think the flip of it really, for me, it was natural, right? Because I wanted to be a part of the experience that everybody else was having, and I may have achieved a certain level of success as a leader. So then now I always felt that I had a responsibility to serve others, to help them. That's what a leader does, right?
So very interesting. So again, I think we are looking at what's that one thing that defined, how you saw leadership, authenticity, and I would say flipping the hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. Jonathan.
Yeah, so I've echo a few things that were already said around here. I think when I first came to the city, I really didn't know anyone. I didn't know anything. So I was feeling my way around for many years and trying to think about, what's my background? And it's in communications and English writing. And then also what's going to be the most valued sort of in the workplace. And so it took me a number of years to sort of figure that out. At mid-career, I went and got a master's in spiritual psychology. And so I found, I went for it for personal reasons, but I found I could bring a lot of that into the workspace as well. And sort of surreptitiously using some of those counseling skills around me, because you're often working in New York City, as we've been saying, it's a very frenetic atmosphere. They're very high achievers, and they sort of can burn themselves out quickly. As you said, they're going to be very difficult people to work with. And so I think having that experience really helped me be more comfortable in the workplace. And, ironically, if you're known as someone who can work with difficult people, you're going to have to be put in roles where you're working with more difficult people. And the challenge there is, how do I not take on that negative energy? And then also, how can I be, a problem solver. And I think the working world today is much more appreciative of people that bring different skills. Whereas, again, when I first moved here, I felt like I had to be a certain way in a certain office and not bring myself. And that can be very draining. And so it's, you're never going to stop learning. You're never going to stop. And that's part of what I enjoy today, working with different companies, working with different personalities, working with different marketplaces and stuff like that. I just find that very intellectually stimulating. And so I think you find ways where, again, at the first of my career, I can find it debilitating, but now I find it more energizing, thinking about different challenges, different people, and so forth.
Interesting. So once again, I think there's this common thread of finding authenticity. I think that's kind of running through all the three. Essentially, finding your own way of becoming a leader, your own way of supporting leadership, and that's what I'm hearing you say. Is that, am I sort of?
Yeah, I think it's supporting the people closest to you, and having those relationships that add to your energy. But then it's also, again, bringing myself and those sort of unique skills that you have, that we all different have, and again, I think that are much more appreciated today. People's backgrounds and skill sets and so forth in terms of problem solving. And it doesn't really help if you have people around the table and they all think in the same certain way. They all went to the same schools and things like that. And so I think there's a much greater openness today towards, hey, we need to bring in a lot of different voices.
Is that, this is very interesting. And before we get into the other discussion on the challenges to leadership, I just want to take that point because I'm sensing a commonality here, which is saying that the workplace has changed in the sense that today there's a lot more openness to the idea that we want authenticity as distinct. We want everybody in the same, sort of type. Is that correct? Is that?
I think there's a greater desire for diversity of, and by diversity, I don't just mean diversity ethnically or by gender, but I mean diversity of thought.
Right.
I think that there's a great desire for different points of view that didn't exist when I started in the corporate world. And it's interesting. There were a couple of comments about people we've all worked for. I've never worked for anybody in a C-suite level role who wasn't challenging, but I've actually worked mostly for really amazing people who were really open-minded and really did want to hear what I had to say. Reflecting on your comment, I had a really horrible boss really early in my career, and I decided, okay, so we have inconsistent values. I'm never doing that again. So like finding somebody with whom you have consistent values, and if one of those values is being open-minded and like looking at the world in a more holistic way, then it always kind of clicks, even though those relationships, particularly if you're on an executive staff role and you're supporting the C-suite, are always pretty challenging. I mean, some of my former bosses may see this. You're all challenging.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, I guess to some extent, bosses have to be challenging because it, in some ways, brings out the best out of us, as long as it's not, it doesn't do the other thing in terms of, yeah. What about you, Eileen? So do you see this change? Do you really think that the workplace has, in that sense, changed?
Completely. And I think because there's a multi-generational culture in most organizations, that I think the younger generation is looking and observing and watching and rejecting leadership of the past or the command and control leadership model. I think there's a lot that's happening in businesses today where that's not going to be tolerated. How long that's going to take, what does that look like, how does it manifest itself? I think that remains to be seen, but I'm hearing it and I'm seeing that there's a lack of patience, or the tolerance level for that is shifting significantly. And I think it's because it's a generational thing.
Let me push on that a little bit. So there are 2 points that are emerging. One, of course, is authenticity. And the other is your point about saying there's a method of leadership which used to be came from the military in the old days and so on. This is a whole command kind of thing, which is now turning to a more of a let me serve you type
More
thing.
heart-centered is what people are looking for.
Right. So, but would you say that the pursuit of authenticity has increased in the sense that tomorrow, if there's a person whose authentic place is to be a little bit more command, let's say, I'm just taking a hypothesis.
I see what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah. So does authenticity, is authenticity acceptable, or is this replacing the other one as a dogma?
I don't know that it's defined quite yet around authenticity. I think it's just sort of getting in there. I don't think it's not what I'm hearing. I think it's, how am I being treated? Do I feel safe? Can I bring my whole self to my job and be okay? And is the leadership that I'm surrounded by going to be open enough to allow that? So it's not necessarily labeled through I'm looking for an authentic leader. I'm looking for somebody who I can be myself with, or I can grow with. So I think it's more on I'll say business terms is more that I'm hearing, but I think it's starting to move in this direction. And there's a need for more genuine, is what I'm hearing, which is a little different than authenticity.
Interesting. What about you, John? Do you see sort of authenticity creeping up, or?
I think it's clipping up. I do think there's still going to be a lot of frictions, like in the workplace. I worked with a company early on that, it was a company, there were a lot of scientists. And so it was, that open-minded sense of discovery. At the same time, they still were pulling in these very regimented practices where the size of the office, the location of your office was very determined by your title. The height of your cubicle walls it's very set,
my God,
and things like that. It was
crazy.
It was crazy.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I see younger generations helping to push against that. I mean, you can read articles all day complaining about millennials in the workplace, their demands. I kind of see it a little differently in that they come with a set of expectations that I'm going to fulfill this role and I'm going to fill it in the best way, but I need to have a life outside of that. So I need to have
Right.
more balance outside of that. And I see that reflected now in HR policies in terms of time off, in terms of, hey, if I'm going to work an excess number of hours and I'm not going to really get paid for that, I need to have that traded back in terms of time off.
What does that imply for a leader? Assuming, since you're a leader of such people, what does that imply for the leader?
Well, I think one of the best teams I ever worked at, it was maybe about 8 to 10 people, but it was very tight knit. And it was, I don't care where the ideas come from. Let's just sit around. We're not going to be hierarchical in any kind of way like that, but everyone's viewpoints, they're all going to see different things. They're all going to notice different things, and no single person is omniscient. And so if we're going to function as tightly and as effectively as a team, we need to be comfortable bringing up pretty anything and talking it through. And that talking it through can be the hardest part. There's an art to receiving negative feedback sometimes, and there's also a very defined art to giving negative feedback. And so I think the more we sort of improve ourselves on both of those, then I just think it's going to be better in the end, both in terms of being successful in the workplace, all of us, at the same time, but then also, just being more open and having a, better relationship that you bring to work, with that work, rather than just being this is what I do in exchange for money. And then that money helps me do things that I enjoy outside of the workplace.
Got it. Okay.
I think role modeling is an interesting aspect of this, because if you're only surrounded by a certain type of leader and you're a new leader coming up, you're going to start to emulate what's around you. And so we need more emphasis on what makes a leader an aspirational leader, so you can start to role model what you want the future leaders to be.
The concern I have in listening to this is that is this a new dogma replacing an earlier dogma? So there was an earlier dogma which was very command oriented. Now I'm hearing a new one which says this is the right way, which is whatever that is, right? Which is let me serve. And so so the challenge, and I see that to some extent potentially as being the opposite of authenticity. Because at the end of the day, authenticity actually has to accept at some level that each one of us is going to be authentic as a leader. And that might or might not fit into this paradigm or that paradigm, or it might be a third paradigm.
Right.
Right.
So this person is quite structured in the way that he or she likes to lead, whereas this person is quite loose in the way he or she likes to lead.
For example.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I'm just leaving an organization that was really good that way, where it was very, very, very open to different styles.
Right.
But it's interesting. I remember interviewing a consultancy years ago, and they really wanted everybody to behave very much in the same way, and to lead in very much in the same way, and to produce output in very much the same way. And I can't blame them, because they want everything to be on brand, right? And that's kind of the thing when you work for a consultancy. But that's what I'm seeing is an increased openness towards people behaving in slightly different ways as a leader, and figuring out how they're going to be a leader versus what's our house style.
Right.
I worked for ex-military people who were fantastic, like amazing. Like one of the best bosses I ever had was a former Navy commander, and I was terrified when I took the job, because I thought he was just going to be like shouting at me and telling me what to do. The first day, I remember him saying, like, listen, if I'm not here, you make a decision, and if you're not here, somebody who works for you make a decision, and nobody ever second guesses anybody else ever.
Right.
And that's how I lead. So yes, we're top down, but we're top down with that kind of flexibility, because in my last job, I flew airplanes, and if something happened to me, we couldn't stop flying the plane.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit, just to sort of get our another perspective in, which is, for a moment, leaving aside the challenges of leadership, let's talk about the challenges of being a leader. And in that difference, what I mean by that is the human being who's the leader. What does it take for them to be a good, or in a good place as a human being?
As a leader.
Yeah, they're leaders, but that's a role at one level in terms of what they do. But they are human beings at another level, right? And so to have well-being as a human being while performing the role of a leader, what are the challenges?
I think one of the challenges is kind of bringing into your awareness field, what are the areas where I'm not so strong on? And I think that can be really difficult for people who have found success through a very certain way that they're behaving in the workplace, and how they've been incentivized, so forth. And so I think the more senior you get, the more you're leading teams, you need to step back and, again, just really think about, hey, these are the qualities, the wonderful qualities that I bring, and these are the areas where I could be, less strong, or, need to work on myself. In other words, to, be a better leader of a team.
Or even just admit. I worked for somebody who was in a very senior role, in a role that would typically be associated with being very, very well organized. And the first conversation I had with this person was, I'm not that organized, and I'm going to need your help. And I thought that was so cool. Like, I mean, I'm not going to fake it, and I'm frankly really good at a lot of other things. So I'm not working on it anymore. What I work on is hiring people like you around me who are going to help me with that.
Yeah.
So knowing where you're strong, and knowing where you need other people to fill in for the areas that you're not.
Well, yeah, I think the anxiety of trying to hide the places where you're not strong is one of the things that like leads you into big trouble as a leader, right? I mean, and I think for me, when being a leader isn't working for me, it's when it's generating anxiety.
Right. For you.
Yeah, for me.
For you.
Yeah. Which is probably, if we're honest, generating anxiety for lots of people around me.
That's right.
Right.
Everybody else, yeah.
I think the difficulty to admit something is sort of very on point. And I think a lot of times those senior leaders, they could be working on this in their subconscious for a long time. And they can sort of feel it there, but it might take a little while to work into their conscious, and feel like they have to, again, do some admitting, which can be very hard to do. But then doing work on it, and hiring people, either working on it themselves, and or bringing in people who have, different skills and different perspectives.
Well, I think it sounds like what we're saying is the self-awareness of an executive or of a leader is paramount. And I've seen a lot of leaders who it doesn't appear that they have a lot of self-awareness. I had a situation when I was in my 20s. I was working for an executive, very, very strong personality, and I was working directly for her. I was in an HR capacity, and she was under a lot of pressures, healthcare, PR. And she was taking all of her frustrations out on me. Like, she was just really not a nice person, I'll say. And I somehow had enough strength to say, I'm not doing this. Like, you're not going to motivate me through this fear strategy. And I just took it upon myself one day to confront her, because if we're going to work this closely together, we need to be working closely together, and we need to be in sync. And this was not going to work. It was actually having the opposite effect. And I was very calm about it. I sort of checked my emotions out at the door, waited for the right time. And she was very abrupt when I asked her if I can have a couple minutes with her. And when I shared with her my concerns and my frustrations, she basically started to cry, and she had zero awareness, so she said, of how she was behaving.
Mm.
Zero. And I was stunned because it was so glaring, and I was having such a positive, negative, not positive, was having such an impact on me that the disconnect of the awareness was very eye-opening to me. It was the turning point of our relationship, because I sort of opened the door to work with her. But it was just very interesting so self-awareness for me is a big part of what I think is necessary.
Got it. Okay. Just coming back to the specific challenges, just in your current role, what's the kind of number one issue that you think is like a sort of classic leadership challenge for you?
Well, I think it's also admitting, there's some things that are out of your control. So if you are a business leader, there are going to be things that impact, the success of your business, which are going to be economic trends, which are going to be trends in a certain marketplace in which you operate. And so I think it can be very difficult, again, sort of admitting these things or not making the progress that you thought you would. And so I think that can be something that people really struggle with.
So, for example, in your context where you're helping people think about communication and so on and so forth, what you're saying is, if a company is not doing well, for example, there are 100 reasons for that. And so is that what you're saying, or you're talking about the impact of the communication itself, uncontrollable at some level?
Well, I just think there's hundreds and hundreds of inputs in terms of the success of a business or a team. And so a lot of those are in your control in terms of how you're developing a product or a service offering, how you're going to market with that, how are you developing the people, how you're thinking about your brand, what that promises to your clients, your customers. And then again, there's other things that are outside of your control. And again, as I get back to, what's that broader climate like? And so that's going to impact the timetable of the success that you're hoping to achieve. So again, I think that can be very frustrating to a lot of folks, and just sort of focusing on the things that are within your power. And I had heard a great phrase that I still think about, daily, weekly, which is, you can't always control what you're going through, but you can control how you're going through it.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Okay. So would you say that's the big one for you as well, James? This lack of this perception of so many variables being out there that you can't really control.
So I actually love that. So in terms of my personal style, like I like to be surrounded by madness.
As an introvert, you like to be surrounded by madness.
Well, I think like the thing that I bring to the table at work is I'm kind of a synthesist. So bringing chaos around me and creating a simple narrative out of it to which the business can respond is sort of how I've made my living. So I like that. I mean, I think for me, the biggest challenge, and it's funny, it's a challenge I'm having now as I try to calibrate because I'm out of this corporate life, is like, how hard do I want to work? So I stepped away from corporate life knowing that I don't want to work as hard as I was working in corporate life. And I worked really, really hard in corporate life. And at one point, I mean, fairly early, not early in my career, probably midway through my career, a CEO who I respected a great deal, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're going to kill yourself. What are you doing? I mean, like, I'm getting emails from you at 2:00 in the morning. Like, why are you doing this? Like, I appreciate the work that you're doing, but I also want you to be sustainable and have a life." And I think for me,
that was nice that he took the time to say that to you.
It remains a very close friend. Actually, was a really remarkable guy who was very, very difficult. I mean, it was very hard to work for in many ways, but also one of the reasons it was so hard to work for is because he cared so much about everybody around him. And sometimes that came through in not such a sweet way. But there was a love behind it, I think. So this gentleman sent me away for a couple of day retreat with other high performing people who were getting ready to explode. And I found out that a lot of us had the same insecurities, and that's what was driving how hard we worked. They solicited 360 feedback from people you worked with and from your family.
And from your family.
From your family.
Oh,
So
that's
yeah.
clever.
So one of the questions was to my wife, is James present in your relationship? And she responded, for James to be emotionally present in the relationship, he would have to be physically present, and he's not, which was witty and made a point, right?
And honest.
So I think that work-life balance thing and understanding, particularly if you love what you do, like just calibrating, like how much do I want to put into it? Like right now, I'm feeling like maybe I'm not working quite hard enough, but and I'm struggling with is that it's like that voice in the back of my head that says you have to work really, really hard, or maybe I'm not really working hard enough, and I'll figure it out.
How about you? The big challenge.
I think handling the level of responsibility and the pressure that comes with leadership is intense. And I've been in an interesting position because I was a leader, but I was also the head of HR. So I was supporting and coaching and really exposed to so many of the leaders within various companies and watching them and listening to their challenges and seeing them, how they show up in meetings and how they handle difficult conversations. And I mean, there's just, you have, as you say, so much input coming from all different aspects, and you got to get up and do it every day. And you don't really get a break. And so just how do you balance that for yourself and the responsibility and not burn out? But it's really that sense of self-care in order to, and I see sometimes that it's really hard for leaders to find that space for their own, I'm going to set you up, Hari, but for their own well-being.
Right. Yeah. Now that's exactly. So this is very interesting. So we covered the way I sort of summarized to myself what I've just heard, 3 or 4 points, right? One is there's an increasing sort of sense in leadership, at least for themselves, of a desire for authenticity. That's one point. The other is, has that transited into is it part of a larger change in organizational thought? Not quite certain.
Well, I think that kind of varies organization to organization too. I mean, so the organization I just left is quite progressive, and it's a European company, not an American company, which is a difference. But I mean, you know, the last couple of years that I worked there, people knew that I worked out at 3:00, and that was okay. And I'm trying to think about the beginning of my career. If I told people that I was going to be taking an hour off at 3:00, like to work out, they'd be like, "Well, good, go have your workout, and then don't come back."
Exactly.
Right. So authenticity, and has it transitioned into a larger thing? Some companies, yes. Maybe some companies not. Third is work-life balance. What does that mean for leaders? But to think about that for themselves, I think that's the third one. What about where all of this stuff sort of moves into to one's personal life, right? Beyond of being a leader, beyond of the company, beyond of our corporate sort of life. What happens? What does this leadership do to our personal lives and the reverse?
I think one is, as you sort of said, you know, is this person present, you know, in their life outside of the workplace? And I think one of those things is that someone puts their needs kind of last, whether they're, you know, they have a partner, whether they're a parent, things like that. And so there can be a lack of self-nurturing, just in terms of recognizing it, or in terms of, you know, you only have so many hours in the day, when it should be the reverse in terms of the greater you work on your energy, the more you have to share.
Got that. So that's very interesting. So what you're saying is the demands of the fact that you have a life beyond the work, a personal life, means that you start to spend a lot of time, energy, attention on that. And one of the outcomes of that, probably a big outcome of that, is that you start to tend to neglect yourself in that whole process.
Because I think there's going to be a certain amount of guilt if you work a certain amount of hours and your attention is sort of elsewhere, and so that you try to overcompensate you know,
Right. So you're working very hard on your work.
Yeah.
And you're working very hard at some level on everybody else in the personal thing. And therefore, in all of this, somewhere the you gets sort of sandwiched.
Yeah. I think it can be exhausting,
Mm.
both in professional and personal, if you let it.
Got it. James, how does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think just finding that space where, I guess, how would I phrase this? Something comes up in my coaching practice a lot, where people are tired, or they aren't totally happy, or there's something at work that's making them unhappy, that's stressing them out and making them anxious, or they've got something at home that's making them anxious and they're bringing that to work with them. And one of the things that is often, when we coach, we help create a frame around something so people can understand what they've said better. So you play back their own words to them in many ways. And I think when you say it, it becomes obvious to people, but sometimes people don't realize they're not good at their job when they're not happy, or they're not as good at their job as they could be when they're not happy. So I think like finding that like that place of being happy both at home and at work makes you better at being a person at home and at work. So, I think about early in my career, the attitude was, well, if you're miserable, suck it up and get it done. And, I think about the millennials when they entered the workplace and like how unbelievably annoying they were. But then as, you start to get some really high performing millennials, you realize they really brought some stuff to the table. And I think they really have, like in terms of like wanting to be more satisfied in their lives and like wanting to be fulfilled. And yes, when they all got out of college and they wanted to be fulfilled in their first job, that was a little rough for leaders. But I think, now that they're kind of hitting their stride in like middle level management roles, I like that. I enjoy working with that generation a lot, and they have great energy. And I think a lot of them have really great values.
And I think as you go up in the leadership, just having that experience with millennials, it helps you in terms of how you approach those younger, professionals that are coming into the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I'm Gen X, so my bosses were boomers, right? And in some cases were the generation before, who were the people who invented command and control.
The old bulls.
Yeah, and the ones who had a bottle of scotch in their desk drawer, and like at the end of the day, that's how they relaxed.
Interesting. So let's turn to now the sort of what next. Therefore, what? Now we've kind of talked about the challenges. We've talked about how the world of the leader is changing because of the new generations, the millennials first, and now the Gen Z. Given all of this change, how is the modern leader adapting? What are they doing? What should they do? In your mind?
Well, I personally think, James, you're going to appreciate that. I think every leader should have a coach.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And coaching over the years was used, and I'm going back several years, was more of a remedial effort or support. Like something was wrong, let's try to fix this person, which I think maybe in some cases that makes sense. But I really believe that everybody should have that confidential, unbiased, objective, caring partner where they can get the support that they need. And I think I always like to use the analogy about advertising. Advertising for years was like one to many, right? But now it's one to one. Everything's one to one. Everything's customizable. Everything's personal. And I think obviously the same thing with leadership, which I love what you're saying about the authenticity of leadership, helping people find that. And coaching, I think, plays a really valuable role. And I'm starting to see that more.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so I would agree. And I'd also actually expand on it. I think every leader of people should be a coach.
Yes, agreed with that as
right.
well.
So I think like understanding like how to do it, and like understanding the difference between coaching and mentoring, and that their life experience is not your life experience.
Just what does coaching actually mean? And like the power of the question. I mean, I know that it informed me as a leader, having gone through that training. I totally agree. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, I think the personality and the tone are incredibly important for the people at the top. And you have to be a communicator these days. It's a big part of your job when you're working through these organizations. And I do think you need to have someone who can come in the room, on a one-on-one basis, whether it's an external sort of coach or whether it's someone on your direct team who can give negative feedback, in a certain way. But at the end of the day, it's someone that is trusted and appreciated. Because again, those leaders, it can be stressful. They cannot have certain skills. So I think that's an invaluable part.
Yeah, but sometimes it's not even negative feedback. Sometimes
Yeah.
when you're working with a leader and
Yeah.
they tell you something they said or did, you'll say, well, how do you think that sounded to the person you were talking to? And they'll take a moment and go, oh, because, usually these people are pretty smart, but in the situation, they're trying to get it done. And I guess I've also, again, had some great role models as CEOs. So,
Yeah.
I work with some really very self-aware, really energizing people. So that's kind of colored my approach to all of this.
I think there are negative projections, and sort of everybody has that, but I think there's also positive projections. And so I think one of the things you can ask a leader is like, hey, who do you really admire in terms of their leadership style? Or who do you really admire in terms of a communicator? And a lot of times they admire that person because they recognize some of those qualities in themselves. And there's a way to sort of like bring that out more in terms of how they are as a leader.
Got it. Now, this is really interesting. So we've kind of covered a lot of ground of where leadership is going. What are the challenges? Let me spend some time on my perspective, coming at it from a little bit on the outside at some level, which is that, bringing the Indic knowledge perspective on how a very ancient knowledge system thinks about the problem of leadership. And let's talk about, and let me sort of put a couple of those propositions out there and see how does that apply to today's New York City, for example, leadership. And the interesting thing is, where does this come from? In the Indic system, a big part of the discussion on the knowledge comes from a discussion on kings, the life of a king. It's very interesting. There's a book, it's actually a huge text called Manasa Lhasa, which is a very old text on what it means to be a king. And a central proposition at the end of it is that you cannot, in the olden days, kings were like, it was hereditary, right? So the prince was going to be a king very different from the king, was the accepted thing. And the notion was that you have to find who you are going to be as a king. And it's very interesting as I'm sitting and listening to all of you here, that's exactly what we are saying 2,000, 2,500 or 3,000 years later. Exactly the same thing that we're saying. So the proposition there is that you have to find your authenticity. But the interesting thing is, how do you find your authenticity? In the Indic system, the how do you find your authenticity is a big part of the story, which is really saying, and what it asks you to do is figure out who you truly are in terms of some of the qualities that you have as a human being. So it defines that by saying we will have some innate qualities that define you, find those qualities, and then start to craft your life in a manner that it's consistent with those qualities, not conflicting with those qualities. This is what the sort of broad principle of how Indic well-being talks about finding authenticity. Does that resonate with you?
It does. Well, I think that would have been something that I would have loved to have heard 25 years ago. I think, I think I opened by saying like that journey towards finding who I was going to be authentically was hard. And I spent a lot of time emulating people. So what you're saying resonates strongly for me. I honestly remember emulating a guy who had a fantastic sense of humor, who would get up on stage and make everybody laugh. I'm funny one-to-one, I think, but not in a big audience. God, I was awful. So embarrassing. So like who am I going to be? And having a process to think about that, and even like realizing I should be thinking about that. It's a pretty big idea.
And one of the places I find that idea being relevant increasingly is the person who's just below the C-suite. Because, one of the things that happens when you transition from just below the C-suite to the C-suite is that you then don't have a place to hide at some level.
Yeah.
You are visible. And you're so massively visible that you have to necessarily find your authenticity or you're going to be found out. Does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah. I think that transition to the C-suite is fraught with peril. So I've actually done some work on that as a coach. It was part of like some of the research I did when I got my certification. And I looked at CEO transitions and what changed. And I mean, I talked to somebody who's got a great sense of humor. But when they got to the C-suite, they realized their sense of humor had to be self-deprecating. It couldn't be facing anybody else anymore.
Right.
Because it wasn't funny to make a joke about somebody else when you're in the C-suite.
Right. Right.
But it's funny if you make fun of yourself.
Right.
And it was part of who this person was. So they didn't lose their authenticity, but they had to adapt a little bit.
Right.
You know, but I think that's, you know, understanding the power of your words, understanding the effect you walking into a room has on people is a really important thing for people to discover. And sometimes they don't get it right away.
Right.
I've had the good fortune of working with a bunch of people who did, but I've seen some people who didn't, and who created a lot of stress for themselves and for all the people around them.
How do you think this whole Indic system, knowledge system that we have, can be utilized in today's sort of leadership challenges?
Well, I think what you're talking about is a more formalized approach to personal development.
Right.
So I spent a lot of time figuring it out on my own.
Right.
Obviously, I'm a strong advocate of coaching, but I think what you're describing for me is a way for people to just kind of think about how they're going to develop as a human.
Right.
And how they're going to develop as a human is very much how they're going to develop as a leader.
Right. And so would you think, would you think this, even today, for an existing leader who's already in a leadership role, this could potentially help them, this kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I talk to a lot of people who are looking for something. And coaching isn't the answer to everything people are looking for. You know? So I've had clients who have said, listen, I think you should go study meditation. I think it'd be really, really powerful for you.
Right.
I've had a couple of clients who come back and said that was like one of the best pieces of advice anybody's ever given me. So I think it fits.
Right.
You know, and I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think that it's something that could be an element of people's development, particularly if they're open to new ideas.
Right. Are they?
Lots of people I know are. Some aren't.
Right. Right. Same question, Jonathan.
Yeah, I think there's been a big shift between those generations of those people who are CEOs versus the people who are below them. And I think it's probably underappreciated a lot in that as we've moved into the information age, the way that people are going to be successful today is going to be a lot different than they were successful. The previous, generation was successful. I think one of those is, you have to be open to a greater field of knowledge. And one of the great things is you have greater access to that today. And then it's also, you have greater access today to knowledge, but at the same time, the speed of data and information is just, can be overwhelming.
Right.
And so you have to work on those two aspects of your personality in terms of being open, again, to a greater field of information, but then also making sure that what's a popular is separating the signal from the noise. And there's another great quote, which is greater access to information creates a deficit of attention.
And this is interesting. So how do you do that? How do you separate the signal from the noise?
I think everyone today, again, it's been such a radical change, is that people just feel snowed under by data and information. So I think it's being very specific with internal audiences and external audiences in terms of what really matters, and pinpointing, are there in the field that I do, it's valuation metrics, financial metrics, but it's also non-financial metrics in terms of how business is reporting, and being very specific for those internal and external audiences to help them sort of recognize this is what's really relevant, and that data point might be a popular one that people look at, but it's not really what we manage to. And it's not something that we're going to really pay attention to.
And so you have to proactively, figure that out for yourself, but also make sure that you stay on point, saying that those are the things that I talk about.
It's really hard to keep things simple. And so I think as you're developing teams, as you're developing strategy, as you're developing how do you communicate, doing it in a very simple and clear way, we're not really perfect in terms of how we receive information. Like 3 to 5 points seems to be that's all we're capable of absorbing at any given point in time. So I think it's helping people understand what those things are that are important, but then also making sure that you're consistently and continuously kind of reinforcing them.
Mm, interesting. Interesting. And in that, how does, if that has to be done, this separating the signal from the noise, um, how does an internal state help in doing that for the person?
I think a lot of times in the work world, you're going through these, ground shifting corporate events, whether it's an acquisition or an integration or crises, things like that. And you can literally look across teams and people respond in very different ways. There are people who are energized by it and sort of moving through these things and they see what that long-term opportunity. And then there are people that just kind of like fall apart. And so I think there is that difference between, again, how people respond. Am I good at working with big challenges? Am I good at working through ambiguity? Because I can see sort of what that long-term picture is, for the organization. And then there are people who don't have a lot of experience and can only really think about what those immediate personal impacts might be.
Got it. So change can be very big now.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is your internal state, your capacity has a dramatic impact on how you're able to sort of perceive the change
Yep.
and respond to the change. Because if you are in a good place, you just approach it
Right.
with more confidence, with more clarity, and so on and so forth. That's interesting. That's very interesting.
No, I think change in contemporary business is a constant state.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's like calculus, right? Where it's just the rate of change
Right.
at this point, and I think the rate of change at the moment is quite rapid.
Pretty high, yeah.
And I mentioned earlier, I like being around the chaos of change, but understanding that for a lot of people around you, that could be causing tremendous anxiety. And people who are anxious, people who are not feeling good, don't perform well. And it's also not great to know that you're making someone feel anxious. So, like as a leader, like recognizing that this situation is causing great anxiety and addressing the whole thing. And I think you can't fix the business situation that's causing anxiety, but you can help the person deal with it better. And I think, we've talked a lot about how do you eat? How do you live? How do you find time for yourself? How do you rest your mind? These are all really important questions.
And if they play out for the leader, and if the leader then is in a good place, what you're saying is that then increases your ability as a leader to sort of keep everybody sort of on point, not get distracted by all of the change.
Yeah, and also understanding if you're a leader who does not necessarily deal with high change environments very well. How do I take care of myself so I don't project that anxiety out?
Right. Got
Right.
it.
Because that's highly contagious.
Right.
So if you have a senior person coming into an organization that's going through change, who comes in the office in the morning like this, or gets onto a call like that, everybody's going to feel that. And I think that's sort of what I was saying earlier about like that responsibility when people hit the C-suite and maybe one level below the C-suite. Your mood can have a dramatic impact on that.
On the
those
company.
around.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, so this is very interesting. So the overall capacity, internal capacity that the leader brings to the table changes the entire dynamic, right? Because then you can be clearer, you can be less anxious. And if you are less anxious, you're likely to project less anxiety. If you are inherently anxious, you can't not project at some level, right? You can't hide it beyond a point.
You're totally setting the tone.
Yeah.
Like the leader does set the tone for culture. Like there's organizational culture, there's team culture. And then within the team culture, you're really determining, you're telling everybody through your behavior what's acceptable, what's not. And then it just sort of trickles down in a lot of ways. I also think there's an assumption that when you're in a corporate setting that you do this vertical climb and that the only way to succeed is to become a leader. And that's not really true, but the system doesn't celebrate, it doesn't reward people as much as those people that do the climb. But not everybody is meant to be a leader.
Sure.
Right? But I think you don't know what the other options are in some cases. That seems to be what gets recognized. And so some of these people, maybe they shouldn't be in a leadership position. And it's not it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's just
It's
what
going
it
to
is.
your point of authenticity. So
Yeah.
how do you take stock of yourself
Right.
to say, gee, I got here because maybe I'm a really good person in the craft, but maybe I don't have what it takes. Maybe I don't want to be a leader.
That's right. Yeah.
And so to the whole point of authenticity, how do you get there before you get there?
So interesting. I promoted someone into a leadership role once who was great at their job, and they did fine in the leadership role. I mean, it was okay. But about 6 months into it, this person came to me and said, "Can I have my old job back?" And I said, "You're doing really well." And he said, "I'm miserable. I'm just really unhappy. I just
What it took him probably to do that job
I'm
probably was
stressed, and the stress of having to manage people I'm bringing home, and I'm not enjoying it. And my last job was very, very stressful, and I left it because it was so stressful. And I really appreciate the confidence you had in me, but I just don't want this job.
Not for me.
Can we do it?" And it's like, yeah, let's figure it out.
But how amazing that he was able to do
I
that.
respected it a great
Yeah,
deal, and this was a pretty junior person.
Yeah.
So to have the and I was a general manager at the time, so for him to have the emotional fortitude to actually sit down and have that conversation with me was really impressive.
Yeah. Good for him.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So let's get to the last part of what I wanted to figure out is, given all of these challenges, are leaders today happy, joyful, or are they by and large not?
Well, I think one of the things in a previous conversation that we had was a lot of times they can be very successful by having this sort of narrow way, and they've become successful by, maximizing that. But also, they can realize that it's come at a certain personal toll, and again, that can be very debilitating, in your professional life and your personal life.
Have you come across a single? Let me pin you down on this a little bit. Okay, have you come across a single CEO in the work that you've done so far that you would sort of turn around in your head and say, you know what, that person's really got it sorted out. He knows, this is success and this is joy, and it's kind of, found the place. Have you come across a person like that?
Yeah, I worked for a great CEO, and he had a blended background where he was like a Ivy League literature major, but then he went straight into the finance world, and a very stressful part of the finance world, and was a big deal, led a huge group at one of the major global banks.
Mm-hmm.
But again, he had a real appreciation for people who were smart, nice, and funny. So that's how he tended to surround himself with. And another thing he'd always say is, I like to work with people who kind of have been through hell.
Mm.
And so they know how to manage these types of situations. And we would do a lot of travel together, and going to meetings here and there, and meeting with investors. And it was just always such a joy, because we would talk about non-business things and be able to laugh. And we'd always, trying to stay in a really nice hotel and have a really good meal and things like that, just so that we were always prepared and felt rested. And so, yeah, he was just a joy to work with. And again, that he created that atmosphere around him meant so much for the organization. I think if you don't consciously think about that, if you have 7 or 8 direct reports, I think sometimes there can be tension between them,
Right.
because there's a certain competition where they don't really feel like they're on the same team, and they're competing for internal resources, and they're competing for attention, and they want to be the one who's sort of consistently recognized for being one of the 1, 2, 3 top people that sort of report in. And so I think that the CEO can do a lot in terms of making that more of we're all together. We're shooting towards the same goal, and understanding that, again, you guys are not a competition. You guys are complementary to what everyone does.
Got it. Same question.
So I'm just left an organization where the CEO and CFO approached their work with tremendous joy and energy. I would go off on a long tangent if I explained why, but we were able to generate a lot of change. So we created a business from 3 separate businesses, brought them together, and then publicly listed it. And this was stressful and a lot of work. And at any given time, as we brought the companies together, all of our jobs were at risk. But we knew we were creating something really cool. So it was really fun to go to work for these people every day.
But if you were to give me 2 sentences on why you think these people were able to find this balance between both success and joy, which very often is not possible. We know this in many cases. Why do you think they were able to do that? What was the unique thing about them?
I think clarity of purpose and perspective really kind of comes down to, I mean, my CFO knew exactly how hard he wanted to work and knew exactly what he wanted to accomplish, and knew exactly what he needed to work on, and got really good at talking to investors really quickly, where I think for a lot of people that would have become really stressful. He had never done it before. As it turned out, he was a natural. The CEO I worked for was so excited about what we were doing. We were almost defining a new industry, and I think like he was excited about putting his fingerprints on the world in that way. I mean, I can tell you when we announced this, before we announced this big thing that we did, I got a call from him on a Sunday afternoon saying, "Hey, you're going to get a call from a lawyer in about 5 minutes. I'm really, really pumped about this thing we're going to do. I can't tell you what it is until after you talk to the lawyer." And it was, we're going to slam 3 businesses together and create one. And I thought, like, wow, I'm really excited about this. That call could have been, you know what, the board wants us to merge with this other company and we could all lose our jobs. That wasn't what it was. It was like, I'm really excited about this. Like, look at this great opportunity. So maybe also this orientation towards optimism may have also been a big help. But I think, and both of these people are just very kind, like just good people to have in your life too, which also made it really kind of wonderful.
Right. Very interesting. Optimism. I think we should take that away with us. Anything from you on this one?
I don't think I can answer the question because I know we're spending a lot of time on like the C level, but my mind goes to a broader sort of purview of just leaders across, let's say VP and above, right? Like officers of companies, where I'm sort of like spanning my, my range. And I don't know. I really don't know, because I see people show up with optimism. I see people show up with frustration. I see people show up with fear. I see people show up wanting to have a good time. I see people being successful. I've just seen so many different scenarios and different attributes, and people showing up in all ways imaginable, from tears to, high-fiving it all over the place. But what does that mean? Like, I don't think when you see people in work in an office setting, and yes, we have personal relationships, I don't think I can answer the question. I don't know.
I understand. I think, and that in a sense is the conundrum that the leader faces, because at the end of the day, they've got to determine for themselves whether they've paid a price or not, or they want to pay, a price in the future. Essentially, that's what you're saying. I don't know whether they're paying a price.
I don't know, because I think we all have sort of, maybe it's the acquired qualities, but we all have sort of a corporate facade, right? A corporate armor that we've sort of grown and acquired over the years. Hopefully, as you get older, you start to shed that a bit more and allow yourself to be more vulnerable. But I don't know what's a facade sometimes and what's real, right? Because we all have a role to play inside a company.
That's a very good point. That's a really good point. I want to sort of end with that point. Let's just dwell on that for a moment. How much of a leader's life can the leader not have a facade in today's context?
I think it's what makes you a great leader is to be able to let go of the facade and allow yourself to be vulnerable. And I did learn this many years ago. I was in a women's group, and I had some secrets, right? Things I don't want people to know about me in the workplace. And then I just put it all out there. Right. Like, I made myself so vulnerable in so many ways, and it was the most freeing, liberating thing that I did for myself as a leader, and it was like a game changer. But it took a lot to be able to do that.
Got it. Yeah.
I think your point's really well taken. I mean, I think that the more we release that facade, the happier we are.
That's where the authenticity comes in.
I think so. And I mean, I think when I think about the two people I was just describing, neither one of them has any facade at all. They are who they are. I mean, I know them personally quite well, and they're the same people. And they've kind of encouraged the people around them to be the same way. So, I mean, like, I think telling people in a corporate environment that you're an introvert would be a really scary thing to do at one point in my career.
Right.
But I mean, do I have to pretend that I like going to large cocktail parties? I don't.
Absolutely not.
I'm like, I mean, people used to text mutual friends and say, "Hey, will you go check on James? He's at this big party. He's probably staying in the corner somewhere."
Hiding in the bathroom.
But yeah, I think that letting go, right, and saying, "Okay, here's who I'm going to be." I think that's one of the things that comes up in coaching all the time too, where people don't realize that maybe that letting go can be their superpower too.
Totally. Yeah, for sure.
I think when you're entering the workforce out of school, I think there's a pressure to perform to a certain archetype, which is based on the culture of that firm. And you learn certain lessons from it, but then at some point you need to unlearn things from that job. And one of those can often be, I need to put myself in a different culture because this isn't working for me anymore. And recognize like, hey, there's really valuable things that I've pulled from this experience, but I need something different, moving forward.
And the important point is that you need to have an awareness of what the I is,
right? Yeah.
For you to be able to arrive at that. Because
exactly. Because you could say, hey, this really works for my friend, over here who I love working with and so forth, but it's just not working for me anymore.
I think that's so important. And I think that's recognizing you're not thriving and not saying that leaving is a failure.
Right.
That like, this isn't working for me and something different might work better for me. And I didn't fail. I gained something from this experience and I contributed something when I had this experience, but this isn't going to last.
Yeah. And you've heard that more like in the past couple of years where it's talked about like the quiet quitting thing where someone realizes that energy exchange just isn't working for them anymore. And I think this is another area where the younger generations that are coming into the workplace are being more vocal about, and they have a greater awareness of what their needs are than maybe someone of sort of my generation.
And we need to celebrate that. I think as leaders, we want to hold on to talent, right? We don't want to, like, there's this whole sense of like loyalty and retention. But if somebody's misaligned and they're not in the right job, as a leader, like, okay, let's get you in the right job. If it means leaving the organization is going to benefit because they'll be able to hire somebody who's going to do the job and it's the right job for them and for the company. But there's still this sort of tension around that I don't think is honored.
It's interesting. My former CFO, who I most recently worked with, we had some pretty senior departures within the finance community. We listed the company, and like lots of people moved on after we listed the company. And I asked him how he felt about it, and he said, "Well, it's really positive. I mean, like, we're a new company, and we have all these people from my organization who are going on to leadership roles in other organizations. So it reflects well on the company, and it reflects well on me.
Right.
And I'm really happy for all of them, and I stay in touch with all of them, and they're all still my friends. I mean, they were my friends when they worked here, and they'll be my friends when they work elsewhere."
Yeah.
And I thought that was such a refreshing attitude.
Very refreshing. Yeah. I'd like to see more of that.
Brilliant. So if there's one word I take away from today's conversation, it is authenticity. You've got to be yourself. And the more you are yourself as a leader, the more everything is going to fall into place for you. Signal to noise. You can pick that up when you're yourself.
Yeah.
Figuring out work-life balance becomes that much easier if you know what you're all about. Working with multiple generations, the consistency that you can bring is totally different when you're authentic versus when you've got a facade. So I think the big message that I'm taking away is that leadership is, at least in today's context, is all about authenticity, and that companies like authenticity.
They need to like it.
Yeah, I think they're starting.
They're starting to like it. They're starting to recognize it.
And many are starting to recognize it, I think.
Awesome. Sounds good. That's
Sounds
a great
good.
note to sort of end the conversation on leadership. Authenticity. Here we come. Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you very much for a wonderful
Good
conversation. I thoroughly
lovely
enjoyed it.
conversation.
Thank you very much.